Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In the previous episode I covered the case of Wendy Spees, in which I also briefly touched on the deaths of two elderly ladies in Bradford in August 1994. I believe their stories deserve to be told, so join me as I delve into the cases of Amy Shepherd and Mary Kilbride. In March 1994, Wendy Spees was murdered in her home in Wakefield. Yet nearly 5 months later, her killer was still at large, and another death prompted fears that he had struck again. This time, roughly 18 miles northwest, in the city of Bradford, where 86-year-old Amy Shepherd dwelt in a flat at the Folly Hall Gardens sheltered housing facility. It was a place she had called home for the last 4 years. Amy had lived alone most of her life, having never married, but she was a social butterfly who cherished her independence, which is why the flat at Folly Hall Gardens meant so much to her. The facility allowed Amy to have her own private space and live independently, but it also gave her the support she required through the assistance of the on-site warden and regular deliveries from Meals on Wheels. Despite her worsening mobility issues, for which she required an aid to move around, and a recent cataract operation, Amy continued to enjoy her busy social life, and was a popular and easily recognisable figure in the area, where she was affectionately known as the Duchess, because of the manner in which she dressed, with her elegant clothing and expensive-looking jewellery. The image Amy presented to the world was reflected inside her home, an immaculately kept abode where everything had its place, without losing its comfortable charm. Amy and Wendy Spees both shared this house-proud characteristic, and found their homes a source of peace and safety, until someone stole it from them. On Tuesday the 2nd of August 1994, after thunderstorms had swept across the country the previous night, the morning had brought fleeting glimpses of sunshine as it tried to compete with the lingering clouds. Amy's movements that morning are not well known, but she was seen at the co-op near her home where she did her weekly shop. After this, she caught a taxi back to her flat at around 4:30 that afternoon. Seeing that his passenger struggled with mobility issues, the driver offered to carry Amy's shopping for her, but the security-conscious lady refused to let him take them any further than the doorstep. Having agreed to this, the driver headed back to his car, observing Amy struggle slightly with the bags, and noticed the door close before he drove off to his next job. Amy would be visited at 8 p.m. by Gordon Anderson. He was the husband of the site warden, who would stop by as part of the checks which were carried out each evening. During these, he would help Amy administer the eye drops she required since her cataract operation. Gordon knocked at Amy's door and received no answer, not even her cheerful voice calling to let him know she was on her way. He called out to her, but with no signs of any movement inside the flat. He tried the door, but it was locked as usual. Concerned by the lack of response, Gordon gained entry to the flat to ensure Amy was safe. Unlocking the door, he called out to her again to make sure she knew he was coming in. But as he entered the living room, he realised why his calls had been in vain, as the 86-year-old lay before him on a blood-soaked carpet. The scene was quickly cordoned off, as the quiet street was inundated with police vehicles, making all the residents in the surrounding flats both curious and nervous. The front door of the flat faced the road, with a short path from the pavement, and no foliage to obscure the view from the surrounding properties, whereas the rear of the single-bedroomed home could be accessed through a set of patio doors, which opened out onto a communal garden, enclosed on three sides by buildings, meaning that despite the property providing some aspect of privacy, it was also overlooked, giving police the hope that someone may have witnessed something. As they began conducting door-to-door inquiries, forensic teams moved into the property to begin the collection of any potentially vital evidence. Two things were immediately identified as being out of place in the otherwise immaculate home. The first and most obvious being a 6-inch serrated kitchen knife, which was lying on the ground between Amy's legs, and was considered to be the likely murder weapon. Yet the second item, a rolled-up tea towel, which had been left on the sofa, was not as straightforward. It may have been left there by Amy herself as she headed to answer the door, or it could have been used by the killer. But it would take more information to discern its purpose. This would be discovered via the post-mortem, carried out by pathologist Dr. John Clark, who noted the extensive and brutal wounds inflicted on the frail 86-year-old. During the examination, Dr. Clark registered bruising consistent with Amy having been beaten. There were signs of a sexual assault, while redness to her neck and petechial hemorrhaging was indicative of strangulation. Fibres recovered from her neck and clothing suggested that the rolled-up tea towel had been used as a ligature. However, Amy had suffered other injuries too. She had a number of broken ribs and a bruising pattern on her chest, which the pathologist deemed could have been caused by the perpetrator kneeling on her, possibly during the final brutal act, in which the killer had driven the knife the full length of the blade into her throat, and then dragged the weapon through her neck, causing extensive injuries. It was clear that the attacker had easily overpowered the 86-year-old, whose age and lack of mobility made her an easy target. But the perpetrator had used excessive force against her, leaving Amy little time or ability to attempt to defend herself. Having been made aware that the octogenarian took her security seriously, police had to ponder how the perpetrator had gained entry to her flat, especially because there was no sign of forced entry, meaning he was either known to Amy or had managed to con his way into the property. Going off the knowledge gleaned from Wendy Spees' murder, in which the culprit was believed to have called at the door to ask for directions, police wondered whether this ruse may have been used on Amy as well. But, unlike in Wendy's case, no one had been seen calling at the 86-year-old's flat that afternoon. However, police could not rule out the possibility that someone had visited the house unseen by others, or their presence was not out of the ordinary, prompting investigators to track down regular visitors to the sheltered housing scheme. This included friends and relatives of other residents, carers and those who delivered food through the Meals on Wheels programme. They also interviewed the taxi driver who had dropped Amy home that afternoon. Yet all of them were ruled out as suspects. There were aspects which differentiated Amy and Wendy's cases. Firstly, there was nothing to suggest the rape had been part of a fetish, which the police believed was the motive behind Wendy's murder. Whereas in Amy's case, the motivation appeared to have been robbery, as it was discovered a number of items were missing from her home. This included 2 rings, a watch, money from her purse and her keys. The latter the killer had used to lock the front door following the attack. These details ruled out a connection with Wendy's death, but with both cases unresolved, it didn't prevent speculation arising, including the suggestion Amy's killer may have been responsible for the death of another elderly lady just 2 weeks later. 80-year-old Mary Kilbride had lived in a large Edwardian semi-detached house on Ruley Lane in Bradford for many years, and she had given up her teaching career to marry and start a family. She and her husband, who was a missionary pastor, had moved into the property following their wedding, where they raised their children, and Mary continued to live there after her husband's death. As a widow whose children had grown and started their own families, Mary dwelt alone in the large home, where she had been virtually housebound due to arthritis that riddled her body. This had made Mary reliant on the kindness of others. Neighbours would often stop for a chat, and her daughter visited regularly, while an individual termed as a male friend would run errands for the elderly lady and visited her every Monday. Yet it was on one of the latter's weekly visits that a horrific discovery was made. On Monday, August the 15th, 1994, the man arrived at his usual time of 9 a.m. to find one of the panes of glass in the front door had been broken. Cautiously he entered the home and made his way through the house until he reached Mary's bedroom, where he found the elderly lady's body. By 9:30, the house Mary had called home for many years was now an official crime scene, with the investigating officers being silently observed by the family pictures situated around the property. Mary would leave her home for the final time and was taken to the mortuary for a post-mortem examination, which would bring to light the true brutality of her final moments, with the pathologist Professor Michael Green stating that the violence appears to be far more than necessary to overpower an elderly woman. The pathologist found that Mary's assailant had stomped on her head and body several times, with such force that she had 15 fractures to her ribs. Aside from this brutal beating, the perpetrator had also stabbed her in the left eye, using the handle of a handheld mirror. But her life was ultimately ended by a towel, which was still wound tightly about her neck. This final detail, alongside the proximity between the crime scenes and items missing from the homes, was likely what led to investigators considering a potential link to Amy Shepherd's murder. But there were some significant differences. Unlike Amy, Mary's killer had gained entry having broken a pane of glass in the front door, through which they were able to reach the key on the inside and let themselves in. This had occurred sometime between 9 p.m. on the Sunday night and 9 a.m. in the morning, whereas Amy had been killed in the early evening. During the autopsy, it was revealed that Mary had not been sexually assaulted, and although Amy had been, the overall brutality of both attacks meant the police could not rule out the possibility they had been targeted by the same individual. There was one other detail regarding Mary's murder which perplexed investigators. It appeared as though the assailant had torn pages out of the 80-year-old's Bible, making them question whether this had been some sort of message from the killer. Speaking to local residents, police learned that Mary was known to be a frail and vulnerable lady who was happy to stop and chat, with one neighbour, 12-year-old Sabila Alisat, stating that she and her friends used to visit the 80-year-old on a weekly basis, recalling, quote, "She was a lonely old lady and was always delighted to see us. We used to go just to cheer her up, and other children used to visit her as well. We just used to talk at her. She would chat about anything. She was just so pleased to have someone to talk to." Her willingness to talk to youths in the area was both charming and concerning, particularly as her sister-in-law, Ethel Hodgson, recalled that, quote, 2 or 3 years ago some young lads conned their way into her house and pinched money. She couldn't stop them. She wouldn't have had enough breath to get across the room. She was crippled with arthritis. These disclosures led investigators to consider the prospect that the death had occurred during a robbery, and perhaps Mary had recognised the perpetrator, who then panicked and ended her life. Exploring this line of inquiry, the police made a breakthrough in the case, with it being announced just 2 days after the murder that an individual was being questioned. On the 19th of August, an 18-year-old roofer would appear in court to be formally charged and remanded in custody while he awaited trial for the murder of Mary Kilbride. He would be named in the press as Richard Whelan, an individual who lived on a street adjacent to Mrs. Kilbride's home. Furthermore, Mary had known Richard and his family since he was 2 years old. She had seen him grow up, likely observed him playing, and was probably delighted by news of his successes. He would have been an individual she would not have perceived as a threat, with it being stated that Richard had often been in her home, helping carry out odd jobs and errands, meaning he was familiar with the house and its layout. His knowledge of the victim and her home strengthened the investigators' theories that the individual may have attacked Mary because she had recognised them. They were also provided some sort of explanation for the Bible's torn pages, as it came to light that Mary would often read the Bible to Richard when he was a child. Richard did admit to breaking into Mary's home. He claimed he was drunk and in need of money, but alleged he never intended to kill her. However, at his trial at Leeds Crown Court in 1995, he would be found guilty of murder and handed a minimum term of 14 years. With no means to connect Richard to the murder of Amy Shepherd, the investigation remained open, but with little progress. In 1996, an individual who had delivered meals to Amy's flat was questioned and released without charge. But then, 2 years later, there was a break in the case. Police interviewed Richard Whelan's former girlfriend, whose relationship with him had started in 1989. She recalled that the following year, the couple, accompanied by Richard's twin brother Andrew and a friend called Karen Hemingway, had visited Amy Shepherd's flat. The group, who were 13 at the time, were denied access to the property. Karen recalled that a couple of days later, she and Richard had returned, and this time Amy let them in and they spent time watching television with her. Armed with this evidence that Richard had known Amy and had been in her property, police pursued the possibility that he had been responsible for her death, and by the year 2000, the still incarcerated Whelan would once again appear in court. While the prosecution, led by Paul Worsley QC, would argue that there were striking similarities between the murder of Amy and Mary, specifically the level of violence used in both cases, the defence would counter that aside from the violent nature of the crimes, there were stark, indisputable differences, pointing out that the means of entry to the properties was different, with one showing signs of a break-in, while the other had no indications of forced entry. The attacks had occurred at different times, with Amy being attacked during the day, while Mary was assaulted at night. And most significant of all was that Amy had been sexually assaulted, whereas Mary had not. Differences were also apparent in the means by which the women had been attacked, with pathologist Professor Michael Green outlining that Mary's injuries, particularly to the ribs, were consistent with being stamped on. However, it was likely that the fractured ribs suffered by Amy had been caused by the assailant kneeling on his victim. The biggest blow to the prosecution's case was delivered by the testimony of two witnesses, Whelan's former girlfriend, Karen Smith, and her friend, Karen Hemingway. During questioning on the stand, Smith would reiterate to prosecutor Paul Worsley the story she had given the police in September 1998. And the former girlfriend stuck to this testimony until her cross-examination by David Robson QC, with her surety crumbling. Smith told the defence that she had made up the story regarding her visits with Richard to Amy's house. And when questioned why she had lied, she claimed that she had felt harassed and pressured by the police, claiming she had, quote, had words put in her mouth. Smith's retraction was backed up by her friend Karen Hemingway, who stated that after the initial visit to Amy's home, during which they were denied entry, none of them had returned to the property. No longer able to place Richard at Amy Shepherd's home, or prove a familiarity between the pair, the case quickly fell apart, to the extent that the judge advised the jury to find the defendant not guilty. It was a devastating blow for Amy's loved ones, who had hoped that they would see justice done. But the case would remain open, and with no further leads to pursue, it lay dormant. However, in January 2018, a cold case review of serious crimes committed in West Yorkshire was undertaken, with detectives revisiting Amy's murder and all the evidence. During this process, they turned to technology, which was in its infancy 24 years earlier. They were advised that DNA had been recovered from Amy's body, and 2 hairs, one recovered from her neck, and the other from the tea towel, which had been used to asphyxiate her. Utilising the latest advances in DNA technology, a profile was created, generating a 1,000,000,000 match to an individual called Raymond Kay, a man known to the police, having been interviewed in 1994 and 1996 in relation to the crime, with it being established that he was familiar with Amy, as he had been responsible for delivering her food through the Meals on Wheels programme. Through this position, it was believed he had been able to gain Amy's trust. Therefore, when he arrived at her door on August 2nd, 1994, she may not have seen him as a threat, nor would his presence on the estate have been considered suspicious by any other resident, as he had been a regular visitor to the flats. However, during his interviews, Raymond Kay informed police that he had stopped delivering meals by June or July in 1994, and had not seen Amy since he left the job. In 1994 and 1996, police were unable to place him at the scene, leaving the original investigators with no choice but to release him without charge, although I have been unable to find out why a DNA swab was not taken at the time, especially if they had evidence from the scene with which they could have made a comparison. Yet the team in 2018 sought to rectify this situation. But despite having evidence which placed Kay at the crime scene, they wanted to strengthen their case against him by digging into his past. What they found only showed what a dangerous individual Kay was. They discovered that in 1973, when Kay was 23 years old, he was convicted alongside another man for robbery. But it was an offence committed in April 1977, which was of most interest to the detectives. Kay had been connected to a robbery in Somerton, Somerset, during which a 77-year-old lady was brutally assaulted, leaving her with a broken jaw and several facial injuries. West Yorkshire Police reached out to the original investigating officer, Brian Watts, who, despite retiring in 1985, and it being against protocol, had at his home key documents and photographs related to the assault, which showed stark similarities between the 2 cases. In 2020, Brian Watts told Somerset Live that, quote, "You're not really meant to do this, but I kept my notebooks from when I worked at the police in Somerset, and they had all the evidence in them. Also, I still had a couple of photographs of the lady's injuries, which were horrific. It's frowned upon, but I don't give a toss. If it wasn't for the evidence that I had kept, they may not have been able to convict him. I would never have recalled the evidence from memory. With a strong case against the now 70-year-old Raymond Kay, the decision was made to arrest him at his home in Baker Fold, Halifax, just 6 miles away from where Amy had been murdered. His response when informed the reason for his arrest was simply, "You're joking." On the 8th of May 2019, Amy's loved ones would once again endure the strain of another trial, hopeful that this time the actual culprit was standing in the dock and they would see justice done. During the proceedings at Bradford Crown Court, prosecutor Richard Wright QC told the jury, "The clear inference is that her killer had targeted her as a suitable candidate for robbery," going on to express that Kay had utilised his role delivering meals to Amy as means of gaining her trust and identifying her as a target, with the prosecutor stating that the elderly lady, quote, "could not have known that her use of that service, a service that she would obviously trust and allow into her home, would introduce her to her killer." It had also been revealed how such an individual with a conviction for burglary had been able to provide this service for elderly and ultimately vulnerable members of the community, with the prosecutor disclosing that Kay had committed road traffic offences and had been given a community service order by Bradford magistrates, which in Kay's case involved delivering Meals on Wheels. Yet records would also show that in contravention with the order, he ceased working on the 5th of June 1994. The access he had to vulnerable individuals became more shocking when it was revealed that Raymond Kay had appeared in court 26 times in relation to 60 offences. This included burglary, theft and deception, which had been committed over a 42-year period, starting in 1964 up until 2006. Having provided a clear history of offending, the prosecution then turned to the evidence which linked Kay to the murder of Amy, pointing to the DNA recovered from the crime scene, which the prosecutor described as compelling, primarily due to it being found on the body and on the towel that had been used in the commission of the crime. Establishing a link to the crime scene, the prosecutor proposed that Kay's initial motive was burglary, adding it, quote, "seems likely to have been the motive for the killing, with sexual assault as some sort of afterthought, perhaps brought on by his violent excitement as he attacked her." 2 weeks after the trial had begun, the jury was sent out to deliberate, but within an hour they returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty, with the Honourable Justice Finola O'Farrell DBE handing Kay a minimum term of 17 years, meaning he would be 88 years old before he'd be eligible for parole. Summarising the events of August 2nd, 1994, Justice O'Farrell stated that Kay, who refused to admit his guilt, had lightly arrived at Amy's home shortly after she had returned from shopping, adding, quote, "she recognised you as a trusted person," and going on to state, "we may never know exactly what happened, but the most likely explanation is you were in the process of stealing and she disturbed you." The judge then addressed the attack on the frail 86-year-old, condemning it as unnecessary, cruel and grotesque. The most serious injuries were strangulation with her own tea towel, a deep stab wound completely severed her upper trachea, a sexual assault, numerous fractured ribs. This attack was brutal, vicious and sustained. The judge also pointed out the futility of his actions, with it being revealed that he only acquired a small amount of money, and the items of jewellery he took had little monetary value. Summing up the case, the judge concluded, this was a murder for gain. The victim was particularly vulnerable. It was committed in her own home. The physical suffering inflicted before her death and gratuitous violence. I accept your primary aim was to steal. You are a career burglar. This was a brutal murder of a defenseless elderly woman. It is inevitable you will die in prison. After 25 years of seeking answers, these words brought some comfort to Amy's last living relative, her nephew Gary Antcliffe, who expressed how the death had affected his family during a victim impact statement in which he recalled, "My auntie was a lovely, harmless old lady. She did not deserve the cruelty she endured, and not a day goes by that my wife and I do not think about her and miss her. Not knowing who committed this crime has caused anxiety, severe upset and depression. This court case gave us some hope of closure." Mary Kilbride and Amy Shepherd were cautious when it came to their security, unwilling to allow strangers into their homes, places they felt safe until someone they believed they could trust betrayed them in the most brutal manner possible. It must have been inconceivable for Mary to perceive that the boy she had known since he was 2 years old, had read the Bible to, looked after, and allowed him into her home to help run errands and do odd jobs, would be her killer. And for Amy Shepherd, Raymond Kay had been the kind and friendly man who had delivered her meals. He didn't seem threatening, so when he arrived on her doorstep that August, she would not have been guarded as she was with the taxi driver, and Kay took advantage of that. Had Amy known his past, I doubt she would have been willing to trust him. But the hardest part to comprehend in her case is how a man who had criminal convictions for burglary, assault and deception was ever allowed to be in such a role in the first place. However, one has to remember that at the time, background checks were not compulsory and would not be until 2002, partially driven by high-profile cases such as the Soham murders. This change now means that anyone working with children or vulnerable individuals can only do so once a disclosure and barring service, known as a DBS check, is carried out, ensuring that individuals such as Amy Shepherd are better protected. Thank you for joining me for It's Murder Up North. A new episode is coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.